In this video, we are going to be discussing mastering the fundamentals of poker tournaments. And before we move forward, it is important to realize that poker tournaments are very different than cash games for a few reasons. The first reason is that there's a payout structure in tournaments that essentially results in chips not being directly one-to-one equal to money won. So you'll find that there are various spots in poker tournaments where you should be quite cautious and quite passive because there's a lot of value in moving up the payout ladder. Also, you're going to find that compared to cash games, you have to learn how to play lots of various short stack situations well, because you're going to end up with all sorts of varying stack depths, usually that are somewhat short in a tournament, whereas in a cash game, you can just reload and have a deep stack all the time. So you're going to find that for the most part, in most tournaments, especially small stakes and online tournaments, you're going to be playing with a medium or shallow stack. So we're not going to cover that in this video. We actually already have a video discussing deep stacked play. Check it out. It is Mastering the Fundamentals of Cash Game Strategy. In this video, we are going to specifically discuss how to play 25 big blinds deep, 15 big blinds deep, and 10 big blinds deep before the flop. We're going to show how your pre-flop strategy should adjust, sometimes very drastically, as your stack decreases. So that's what we're going to be covering in this video. Let's get right to it. First, we're going to discuss pre-flop strategy, then we're going to move on to post-flop strategy later. We're going to start discussing 25 big blind poker. And I realize you may find yourself with a deeper stack than 25 big blinds, but check out all the other content I've made and the content at pokercoaching.com that discusses how to play deeper stack depths. In general, when they fold to you before the flop, playing 25 big blinds deep, I generally recommend you follow the GTO charts we have available at pokercoaching.com in our app. Simple as that. I know a lot of people think that they want to try to maximally adjust to take advantage of the things their opponent's doing correctly, but before the flop, it's kind of hard to get too out of line unless your opponents are just overly weak and tight and passive. And, maybe your opponents will be weak and tight and passive. But I think if anything, as stacks start to get a little bit shallow, a lot of players start shoving all in far too often, which does not allow you to open raise all that wide. So follow the GTO charts. I'm going to be showing you the GTO charts in just a second, so you have GTO charts for many common scenarios you will be in. When they fold to you, you should usually raise to 2 big blinds. Slightly bigger may be fine. Doesn't make that much of a difference, but you do not want to be raising to 3 big blinds or 4 big blinds or 5 big blinds. Because whenever you raise to a bigger raise size and then you get shoved on, you end up losing more than is necessary. Because if you raise to 2 big blinds and they go all in, you lose 2. But if you raise to 3 and they go all in, you lose 3 when you raise and then fold, right? And that does add up in the long run. Do not open limp. The only exception to this is when they fold to you specifically in the small blind, and we'll be discussing that later. But if you are first to act, do not open limp. I do know that perhaps in some super duper advanced GTO world, you may want to be limping from some positions with some hands, but that overly complicates your strategy and adds almost no equity to your overall strategy. So I'm trying to give you simple, implementable advice that will have you playing very close to the GTO strategy. That will be a whole lot easier to implement than something that's very complicated. Also, you should not open shove all in 25 big blinds deep. Some players, they think, all right, 25 big blinds, I'm short stack, let's rip it in. But no, if they fold to you, the only spot you should be shoving all in from is the small blind. And like I say here, only make big adjustments once you know what your opponent's doing correctly. And if you are playing a tournament with players you haven't really played with all that often, it's often going to be very difficult to know what they do incorrectly. So let's get right to it. Here are 25 big blind pre-flop opening ranges for under the gun, hijack, and the button. You all know where the button is. The position to the right of the button is the cutoff. The position to that player's right is the hijack. And this is under the gun, which is first to act, playing 8-handed. If you were playing 10-handed, you would play tighter than this. So all these hands in red are raised to the minimum. All the hands in gray are folded. So we see from under the gun, we are raising something like pocket 5s and better, ace-3 suited and better, ace-10 offsuit and better, king-7 suited and better, king-10 offsuit and better, queen-8 suited and better, queen-jack offsuit, jack-9 suited and better, 10-8 suited and better, 9-8 suited, and 8-7 suited. And that's about it. We're folding everything else. Notice we're not playing ace-9, we're not playing pocket 4s, we're not playing jack-8 suited, we're not even playing ace-2 suited. Now, if you wanted to widen this range a tiny bit, it's probably okay. If you told me you wanted to raise every pair, every ace-x suited, I don't think it's that big of a deal. It's probably fine. That said, this is the GTO strategy against players who play well. I do think most people err towards being a little bit too tight and a little bit too cautious, which will let you raise slightly wider. It's also worth noting, these charts presume there is an ante in play. If there is no ante in play in your particular venue or your particular tournament, you should play tighter than is recommended here because you're trying to win less money. As the pot gets smaller, you are risking more, or actually the same amount, to win less, right? And therefore that forces you to play tighter. So we see, under the gun, you're raising with 18.6% of hands. This might be a little bit small for you, but it's 18.6% of hands. From the hijack seat, middle position, you see now we're raising slightly wider. Notice every ace-x suited is raising, king 4 suited is raising, queen 6 suited is raising. A lot of players don't raise hands in this region, and that's probably a mistake. We see suited connectors and suited gappers raising for the most part. Any 2 Broadway cards, jack 10 offsuit and better, and ace 7 offsuit and better. Notice though, pocket 3s and pocket 2s still does not raise. These are just not good hands. And that's something that you should note from learning to play GTO strategies, is that hands like queen 6 suited is better than pocket 3s, which is kind of interesting when you're playing shallow stack, right? A lot of people think, oh, I have a pair. It's a good hand. I can just rip it in. But no. It is not a good hand. It plays incredibly poorly because usually you flop an underpair, and it's hard to get to the showdown with an underpair in a medium or a big pot. From the button, this is where we get to play the widest. Notice we're playing queen 2 suited and better, any ace. Still not every pair, though. Pocket 2s finds a fold. Lots of suited hands, not so many offsuit hands. We do see king 7 offsuit's the worst hand we're raising. It is worth noting if we were deeper stacked, we could raise wider, because when you're deeper stacked and in position, your positional advantage is magnified because you have a deeper stack depth and you can take advantage of the fact that you're in position by putting in bigger bets on the turn in the river. In this scenario, though, we only get to raise 46% of hands. Like I said earlier, you probably can raise slightly looser than this, but not much looser. You should not be raising 75% of hands on the button very often at all. You need the most weak, tight, passive opponents ever to justify raising with an overly wide range. And all the positions between these positions, so say we're in the cutoff, you see the hijack and then the button, right? So the cutoff is between these 2 players. You would raise somewhere in the middle between these 2 ranges. And you can extrapolate to figure out roughly what that is, or you can go to pokercoaching.com. In our app, we have all of the ranges available for premium members. So this is what you do when they fold you. Nothing fancy. Raise 2 big blinds with these hands, fold everything else. What about when they fold you in the small blind? This is where it gets slightly tricky because now you're only playing against 1 player, but you're out of position and you're getting amazing odds. You have to put in half a big blind to try to win a total pot of 3 big blinds. Remember, the small blind, the big blind, and the ante. So you don't need to realize much equity at all. And whenever that's the case, you're going to find that you should be doing a lot of limping. Whenever you're getting excellent odds, you just want to try to find a way to see the flop with as many hands as possible. So here is the game theory optimal strategy. Usually from the small blind, you'll do something like this when you're playing medium or deep stack. You'll raise the best hands. We see like pocket 6s and better is raising most of the time. Lots of good ace-x's raising. Lots of suited high cards are raising. And then you raise with a lot of junky hands. Usually ace-x offsuit, king-x offsuit, queen-x offsuit, jack-x offsuit, and junky suited hands. And then you limp everything else. You do see that all these hands are using a mixed strategy, meaning sometimes you limp, sometimes you raise. You got to mix it up. You do need to mix it up, and you especially need to mix it up out of position because you want to make sure that when you limp, your range is not all garbage, and you want to make sure when you raise, your range is not all strong because then you become super duper easy to play against. Notice we have this dark red color introduced now. These hands are shoved all in. We see 4s, 3s, and 2s open shove, as do ace 9 and ace 8 sometimes. I don't think you need to have these in your range for simplicity. It's only 1.8% of hands, but if you're trying to strictly follow the charts, they are shoved. You may wonder why we're not raising stuff like queen jack suited, king 9 suited, queen 8 suited, stuff like that. It's pretty good, right? If you raise and then your opponent goes all in, you have to fold those hands or make a loose call, and that's not what you want. You'd much rather limp and then have your opponent raise, and then you can call and see the flop with those hands every time. All right. Do note that some players will fold far too often. Against those players, raise far more often. Alternatively, some players will raise limps far too often. If that's the case, maybe limp less often with these junky hands on the bottom portion of the range, and limp more often with your nuts. So always make sure you're adjusting, and if there is a spot where you can kind of get out of line and adjust, it is when they fold to you blind versus blind, because usually, well, then you're only playing against 1 player, and maybe you have some clue about what they do incorrectly. Also worth noting, when you're in the big blind, you will never be first to act before the flop because either everyone folds to you and you win the pot, or somebody raises, or the small blind limps, and we're going to be discussing those situations in just a few minutes when we discuss 25 big blind strategy facing a raise. Again, please follow the GTO charts. Now, look, some players raise super duper tight, some players raise super duper loose, and you need to figure out what your particular opponents do and then adjust logically. But when you don't know what your opponents are doing, following the GTO charts is a very, very nice starting strategy. When you are playing 25 big blinds deep, you should have a calling range, a 3-betting non-all-in range, and a 3-betting all-in range. A lot of people think that in this spot their only options are all-in or fold. That is definitely not true. There are people out there who sell apps that show you the all-in or fold strategy, but you do have the option to call or re-raise non-all-in and then fold if they shove on you. That is fine and good poker. In general, your 3-bet non-all-in range should be your best hands that are happy to get a lot of money in, and blockers that are not quite good enough to call. These are going to be a bunch of weak offsuit high cards, essentially. And what that does is that when you re-raise non-all-in, and then you get shoved on, you either have the nuts, and you can easily call, or you have some junky hand that can easily fold, but you have cards in your hand that make it more difficult for your opponent to shove, because if you have, let's say, an ace in your hand or a king in your hand, it's less likely that your opponent has aces or ace-king, right? In general, as you face a raise from later and later position, or a wider range in general, you should be going all in with a much wider range, because as your opponent's raising too wide, they're just going to naturally have to overfold in that situation if you shove. So if you're playing against a loose, splashy maniac, it's great to shove all in on them because they're just going to have to fold a lot or call with some garbage. You're going to find that the hands that prefer to go all in are usually the hands that are likely good but vulnerable. And these are going to be hands like middle pairs and decent suited connected hands. So let's take a look at some charts. Here we have the hijack versus a raise from under the gun. So under the gun raises and we are in the hijack. What do we do? Well, we do see some all-ins, 25 big blinds deep. We see 10s and 9s shoving. Ace-king, that's a hand I didn't mention. Ace-king and ace-queen often do find some shoves. And then king-queen suited and queen-jack suited. This is going to be very typical in this scenario, and I would be shoving with these hands most of the time. We're re-raising small with our nuts, like I said, aces, kings, queens, jacks, ace-king. And then some hands that are not quite good enough to shove and happily get the money in, which is going to be ace-jack, ace-10, ace-queen offsuit even against under the gun because they should have a really good range. And then a few suited connected hands that are at the bottom of playability, right? Mostly, though, we're re-raising with our best hands plus a few high card blocker hands. And if we do re-raise a hand like king-queen offsuit and they shove, we fold. So in this scenario, they make it 2, we make it 5, they make it 25, we fold. Hands like king, queen, and ace-jack. And then we call all the hands that flop well enough. Again, I realize a lot of these hands are using very mixed strategies where they re-raise sometimes and call sometimes, and you should mix it up in various ways. For simplicity, maybe what you would like to do is make an implementable strategy where maybe you 3-bet the ace-jack offsuit every time, and you call ace-queen and king-queen every time. I think that's reasonable. You're going to lose a little bit of EV compared to the GTO strategy, but it's going to be very, very easy to implement. And we actually have downloadable, implementable charts at pokercoaching.com in the tools section as well, if you do want to use those. So anyway, this is what we're doing. We're calling with hands that flop very well, suited hands for the most part, and good big cards, and small pairs and medium pairs, re-raising small with the nuts, shoving hands that are almost always good but vulnerable. Button versus under the gun. We're not actually going to get to shove all that much more often because the under the gun's range should be very strong, right? The problem here is that under the gun is very strong, therefore we just don't want to put a lot of money in. So we see our 3-betting range is actually pretty tight still, only 5.2% of hands total. But we get to call a whole lot more because now we are going to be on the button in position, and there are only 2 players yet to act who can shove, whereas when you're in the hijack seat, there's 4 players yet to act who can shove. So we see a relatively similar shoving range, relatively similar 3-betting range, but a much wider calling range of more suited connectors, suited hands, and pairs, plus a few more big cards. I would say in general, if you wanted to err towards folding out stuff like queen jack and king jack pre-flop and king 6 and king 7 and queen 8 and jack 8 suited, I think that's probably fine, but you do get to call decently wide, even 25 big blinds deep when you are on the button. Now let's take a look at button versus hijack. So the difference here is that the hijack is raising with a much wider range than under the gun. Remember I said, as the raise is going to be from a wider range, that should result in you going all in more often, right? That's a very common adjustment. So we see here, we actually do go all in a decent amount more often. We were shoving 2% of the time against under the gun. Now we're shoving 4.4% of the time, a lot more, over twice as often, but with a similar selection of hands, right? We see instead of ace king only, we have ace king and ace queen. Instead of king jack suited and queen jack suited, it's now king jack suited, king 10 suited, queen 10 suited, queen jack suited, jack 10 suited some portion of the time. Also, we shove with more middle pairs, and we do see more low suited aces opting to shove too. Interestingly enough, our calling range is similar, right? We're really not calling all that much wider against the hijack than we are against under the gun, which is cool to see. The change here is that when the opponent's range gets wider, we are shoving more often. We're not necessarily calling all that much more often. Because, to be fair, the hijack's range should be reasonable, right? If we go back over here, the hijack's raising with this range that we discussed earlier, and it's not particularly weak, so it's not like you can just blast them. All right, that's how to play facing a raise when you're in position. What about when you are out of position? Well, when you're out of position, you're going to be doing a whole lot more shoving in general. We're going to be discussing specifically from the small blind now, and then the big blind next. So, small blind versus under the gun raise, you're going to have to be pretty tight, but notice still a pretty wide calling range. This is because when they raise to 2 big blinds and you're in the small blind, you have to put in 1.5 big blinds to try to win the small blind, the big blind, the initial raise, that's 4, and the ante, it's 4.5. 4.5 right now. So you have to put in 1.5 to try to win a total of 6. So you only need to realize 25% equity. It is going to be 3 ways a lot of the time, but it's not hard to realize 25% equity with all these hands in green. These hands in green all flop very well, right? Notice we are still re-raising mostly our best hands, plus some of those blocker bluffs like we discussed, and we are still shoving a relatively similar range too of ace, king, ace, queen, some good, strong, high-suited connected hands, middle pairs, and some ace-x suiteds. Common stuff. You'll see these patterns repeat over and over. As the raise comes from later and later position, you're going to find that you don't really get to play all that many more hands. Notice against under the gun, we're folding 73%. Against hijack, we're folding 74%. And against button, we're folding 73%. So we're just playing a slightly looser range, but our re-raising and our shoving ranges are going to get substantially wider. So small blind versus hijack, you see we're shoving way more often with a lot of pairs now. Still 3-betting small with the nuts. Aces, kings, queens, jacks, ace, jack suited and better. And then some blocker bluffs. Ace 9, ace 8, ace 7, queen, jack, stuff like that. And then we're calling decently wide, right? We're calling with all sorts of hands that have decent equity, that flop well enough. Again, if you wanted to fold out some of these hands that are using mixed strategies on the bottom, I think that's probably fine. And especially in a tournament, if you are in a scenario where there are payout implications at all, like if you're getting near the bubble, you definitely will want to fold out these hands at the bottom of playability, because these hands at the bottom of playability are barely profitable. And if a hand is barely profitable and you want to make sure you don't take small edges or find yourself in dicey spots, a good way to avoid that is to not play those hands. Small blind versus button, again, way more shoving, right? We're against the widest range we're going to be against on the button, and now we are shoving a much wider range, 14% of hands. We do still have a little bit of a calling range. We definitely have a re-raise non-all-in range, right? Of the best hands plus blockers in this region. But now a lot of shoving with 10s and lower, lots of weak ace-x suited, lots of ace-x offsuits, and some good, strong, high-suited connected type hands. Okay? You definitely see the same patterns repeat over and over again, with the ranges just getting wider and wider as stacks get, or as the ranges you're against get wider and wider. Also, as stacks get shallower and shallower, you often see yourself shoving wider and wider too. We'll discuss 15 big blind play in a bit. All right, here we have big blind ranges versus a raise, big blind versus under the gun. Now from the big blind, this presumes the big blind raises and everyone folds around to you. We're not going to get into multi-way spots in this video because that becomes another whole gigantic topic. We'll actually make a mastering the fundamentals of multi-way pots at some point in the future. So big blind, under the gun raises, big blind calls. You do a ton of calling because now we have to put in one big blind to try to win a total of how much? Their 2, our 2, the small blind, and the ante. So we have to put in 1 to win 5.5. We don't have to realize very much equity at all. So we get to call with a pretty wide range. Again, in a tournament, you may want to fold out some of the weaker hands that are in this offsuit junky region. I think that's fine. Notice, though, our shoving range is still pretty similar to when we were in the small blind, where we're shoving middle pairs, ace king and ace queen, a few suited connected type hands, right? And our small re-raising range, not all in, is just the nuts and some ace x and king x blockers. Same thing, right? Big blind versus hijack. Notice we do get to defend a little bit wider now because we are in the big blind closing the action. More shoves, though. A whole lot more shoves with the same type of hands. Pairs, ace x, or ace king, ace queen, ace jack type stuff. A few suited connectors. Again, 3-betting small with our nuts and some blocker bluffs. Same thing, big blind versus button. Lots more shoves now, up to 11% of hands. King 7, King 6, and King 5 are suited hands, which like to rip it in, which is fun. They're almost like suited connectors, but blockers. They're not really suited connectors, I understand. But notice, though, a whole lot of offsuit, junky, 3-bet non-all-ins with a lot of King X, Queen X, Jack X, and 10X. This is something not very many people do. When the button raises to 2 big blinds, very few people in the big blind are making it 6 or 7 big blinds with the Jack 5 offsuit. They just don't do it. And that results in their re-raising range being incredibly, incredibly strong, which is a problem because then you're super duper easy to play against. You need to mix in these bluffs. I realize they don't happen all that often. And, if you wanted to make this an implementable chart, maybe you just 3-bet something like, I don't know, Queen 3 suited and Jack 4 offsuit every time. But those hands exist, and you do want to make sure that you do 3-bet them sometimes. That is important. Otherwise, you're easy to play against. Here we have pre-flop blind versus blind ranges. Here's the big blind versus the small blind limp. We discussed this scenario earlier. This is the only time you should be facing limps in GTO world. If your opponents are making blunders and they're limping all sorts of nonsense, your strategy is going to be very different. Again, we can't get into discussing every single exploit you could possibly make in this video, although we do have a lot of that content over at pokercoaching.com. Here, big blind versus small blind limp. This is a very common scenario where you're going to be raising your best hands and then raising a bunch of junk, especially a lot of the offsuit junk that doesn't fare especially well. This results in you having either a really good hand or a kind of junky hand, and that makes it very difficult for your opponent. We do actually shove 25 big blinds deep in the big blind when the small blind limps, sometimes mainly with the small pairs, 6s and lower, and a few ace-x offsuits. Big blind versus small blind raise. This is an interesting scenario where now we can't really 3-bet non-all-in all that happily, because if they make it, let's say 3, and then we make it 7.5 or 8, if they shove, we now have to call, let's say, 16 or 17 to try to win 50. So we only need 33, 35% equity to call, and most hands are going to have 33 or 35% equity to call. So you see now we do not get to re-raise small. When you re-raise small and you're getting good odds to call an all-in, you just don't get to re-raise small anymore. Instead, you opt to either call or shove everything. And interestingly enough, you actually do a lot of slow playing in this spot. Notice aces, kings, queens, jacks, all the big pairs opt to just call a raise from the small blind when you're in the big blind. Now, why would that happen? Well, that would happen because you really want to be able to call with as wide of a range as possible, so you really need to strengthen your calling range. And you do that by including the absolute best hands that are the least likely to get outdrawn, and those are the big pairs. We do call with all sorts of stuff in this scenario. Notice we don't call the weakest offsuit hands. These are not great at all. We don't call the absolute trash suited hands either. We do still shove those small pairs and some ace-x. A few random king-x at the bottom. Let's talk about small blind versus big blind raise. This is when small blind limps, big blind now raises with this range. So the big blind's raising with this range. What should we do? Well, turns out kind of a similar scenario when the big blind limps and the small blind raises. Here, when small blind limps and big blind raises, we're shoving the small pairs, shoving a lot of ace-x, a few king-x suited and ace-x suited, and then doing a lot of calling with hands that flop well enough. The hands in gray we don't have because we would have raised those pre-flop, right? So that's it. That's what happens when someone raises before the flop. You'll see these patterns present themselves over and over, and this is why you see a lot of the best players in the world playing very, very good pre-flop poker, because it's not actually all that difficult to roughly memorize these strategies, or at least memorize the common situations you're going to find yourself in. All right, let's discuss now. Facing a non-all-in 3-bet. Again, follow the charts. Understand that you can still have a calling range. This is when you raise, and then to, let's say, 2 big blinds, and then someone makes it 5 big blinds. You can still call. You have to put in 3 to try to win something like 12. You only need to realize 25% equity, therefore, you can have a calling range. You, however, cannot have a 4-bet range less than all in here, because if you make it 2 and they make it 5 and then you make it 11 and they shove, now you have to put in 14 to try to win 50. And that's, again, that situation where you need 30-ish% equity to justify calling, and you will. We're not going to discuss this exact scenario here, but if there's a raise and a 3-bet before you, so let's say low jack raises and button 3-bets and you're in the small blind, you need to be very, very tight. And it's just like you only shove a lot of your best hands for 25 big blinds in this scenario. Maybe like aces, kings, queens, jacks, 10s, 9s, ace, king, ace, queen, something like that. When you face a raise and a 3-bet, you have to be super duper nitty. If you're against tight ranges, you have to be even more nitty. And that's that. We're not going to be discussing that exact scenario, though. All right. 25 big blinds, preflop ranges versus a raise, under the gun versus the hijack. So this is when we raise under the gun, and then the hijack 3-bets us with this range. So they're 3-betting with this range in red, which you see here is aces, kings, queens, jacks, ace, king, and then a few of these suited connected type hands and a few of the ace-x offsuits. So what do we do against that? Well, we get to call decently wide, shockingly wide. Now, these hands are showing that they are completely full in the cell. We don't raise every 7-6 suited, I don't think. So realize this is not every 7-6 suited that you were dealt preflop, because you would not have them all in this scenario. So this chart may be slightly misleading, but we do a decent amount of calling in this scenario. That said, we do still shove the hands that are almost always good but vulnerable, right? And that's just going to be our best hands in this scenario for the most part. Plus a few bluffs. The bluffs are very often, when we are shoving all in at this stack depth, they're going to be ace-x suiteds. You're going to find a lot of ace-x suiteds really, really, really like to shove. And if you want to call it a bluff, hands like ace, queen, and ace-jack offsuit also do a decent amount of shoving when you're out of position. Notice aces does slow play, which is kind of cool to see. Aces is going to do a lot of slow playing when you raise and then get 3-bet, because that allows you to call with a slightly wider range, which you want to do. You want to be able to call as wide as you can, because that essentially lets you realize your equity. At the end of the day, poker is all about getting whatever money you are owed out of the pot. And if you end up folding out those hands, you get none of your equity out of the pot, right? So you want to be able to realize as much equity as possible, which is why you have to slow play some of your best hands most of the time. Notice all these hands using mixed strategies. These are hands that I think it's definitely reasonable to fold. I think it's fine to get out of the way with these hands, especially in a tournament like we discussed earlier. Here we have under the gun versus the button. Notice a relatively similar strategy. And the reason we're playing a relatively similar strategy here is because if you go back to the opponent's re-raising strategy, notice hijack versus under the gun and button versus under the gun, the opponent's 3-bet range is actually kind of similar, right? It's all roughly the same hands. It's just aces, kings, queens, jacks, ace, king, and a few bluffs, right? So because the opponent's range is basically the same, that forces us to play pretty close to the same. And if you look at these two charts, they almost line up perfectly right on top of each other. And that's good to know, right? It's good to know that if the opponent's range is the same, despite whatever position they're in this scenario, you're going to go with the same hands, which is good. But we do still see the same patterns, lots of ace-x suited bluffs that some players miss on a very, very regular basis. Here we have hijack versus button. So we raise the hijack, the button 3-bets. Where is that chart? Here we have button versus hijack. So they're re-raising with mostly good hands again, right? When they're re-raising mostly good hands, again, in this scenario, we get to shove with roughly that same range, right? Notice a lot of pairs, ace, king, and ace, queen, some suited ace-x, and that's it. And then we do a decent amount of calling with a lot of the suited hands. It is worth noting a lot of the suited hands that are connected or king high, they do a lot of calling in this spot because you're getting good odds. When you're getting good odds, you can't go around folding decent suited hands. This is a spot where a lot of people drastically overfold, and they may only call with something like suited broadways and better. But notice you'd be missing out on a large chunk of your calling range in this situation, and that is a problem. Let's take a look at 25 big blind ranges versus a small blind 3-bet, not all in again. So we do see a relatively similar pattern under the gun versus small blind and hijack versus small blind to some extent. We're just shoving aces, ace, king, queens, maybe a few other small pairs, and some ace-x suiteds. When you raise under the gun in the small blind 3-bets compared to the hijack, though, you have to be quite tight when you do get 3-bet, because a small blind should be 3-betting under the gun with a very, very strong range, right? Whereas when your raise comes from a later and later position, such as when you're in the hijack or the button, now they're re-raising with a wider range naturally, and because they're re-raising with a wider range naturally, you have to defend with more hands. You will see you're folding a decent chunk in all of these scenarios, and that's fine. Understand the offsuit hands do pretty poorly. I think a lot of people mess up by defending with stuff like King Jack offsuit every time or Queen 10 offsuit every time. Like you'll see Queen 10 folds in this scenario every single time to a 3-bet. And that's something that you must do. The offsuit hands are really, really bad to call 3-bets with in general. They're going to be dominated, and they don't flop especially well. We do see button versus small blind. We're now shoving a decent chunk of the time, especially with the ace-x. High ace-x offsuit, low ace-x suited, and the small and medium pairs. These are hands that are almost always good but vulnerable, and therefore we get to shove them. All right, here we have a situation now where we're in the big blind. Under the gun raises, big blind. 3-bets, it's back on us. We do see a decent amount of calling and not a whole lot of shoves. If you recall, the charts in the big blind facing a raise don't actually 3-bet small all that often. So because your opponent should not be 3-betting small all that often, you in turn don't get to shove all that often. You do still get to call though. You're in position, you're closing the action, and we do see all the hands that are decent and suited do call a large chunk of the time in this situation. All right, what about the last spot we're going to discuss before the flop, 25 big blinds deep? What happens when you raise and then someone shoves? Well, now it just straight becomes a math problem where you have to ask which hands are getting the correct odds against the opponent's shoving range. And also in tournaments, you should call a little bit tighter than these charts recommend because most people don't shove as often as they should. And then also most people, well, in a tournament, there are payout implications, then you don't want to get it all in because if you get it all in one time and lose, you lose all future earning potential in the tournament. You can't just reload, right? This is a spot where you definitely want to adjust your opponent's tendencies because some players will have no non-all-in 3-bet range. So if we go back to these charts here and imagine you're in this situation where you raise the hijack in the big blind, it's on the big blind. Imagine they shove every hand in red here, both light red and dark red. What does that do to their range? Well, it makes their range stronger, right? So if they use a shove or call or fold strategy, you're going to find that you usually have to call their shoves tighter than if they use a shove strategy where they're not shoving with their best hands and they 3-bet those hands small instead, right? So you definitely want to make sure you are hyper aware of what your opponent's strategy looks like and that you adjust accordingly. Some players will shove far too often. Some players will shove too infrequently, and you definitely want to adjust. I would say in general, most people shove with slightly stronger ranges than they should. Therefore, you should fold a little bit more often. Also, we are 25 big blinds deep, so when we raise to 2 and they make it 25, you just don't call all that often because you're getting horrible odds. So, under the gun versus a hijack raise. We call it off with 7s and better, ace-jack suited and better, and ace-queen even folds sometimes. A lot of people don't fold ace-king here, but you should. I think most people fold 7s, and that's probably fine. Again, you may want to call slightly tighter than this, but notice we're calling almost nothing, right? Under the gun versus button, similar story. Remember, the button should be shoving with roughly the same range as the hijack should, so we're going to call off with the same range. Here we have hijack versus button. Now we have to call slightly wider because the button's going to be shoving wider because they're against a wider range to begin with. But even then, notice we're not calling off super duper wide. Basically 6s and better, ace-10 suited and better, ace-jack offsuit, and king-jack suited and better. And that's it. Pretty tight range, right? And that's okay. A lot of people raise with hands, well, like the GTO preflop raising range, and they end up folding out a decent amount of the time to the shove. But that's okay. It's okay to fold 2 shoves in this scenario because you're getting really bad odds. All right, what about versus a small blind shove? Now, let's say under the gun raises, small blind shoves, back to us under the gun. We call it off with just the best hands again because we're against a strong range. Hijack versus a small blind shove, we have to call off wider, right? You see now something like 5s and better, ace-10 offsuit and better, king-jack suited and better because we're against a wider range. So as your opponent's range gets wider, you have to call off with a wider range. And we see button versus small blind, we now call off quite wide. Maybe not as wide as you think we should, but quite wide with 4s and better, ace-5 suited and better, ace-8 offsuit and better, king-jack suited and better, and king-queen. And then fold everything else. It's okay to raise and then just get out of the way. Versus a big blind, we're going to see a similar strategy where we are just calling off with very good hands. I'm not going to go through and read all these. Feel free to pause the video if you want to look through them all. But it's actually kind of similar to when we raise and the small blind shoves. Our calling ranges are not all that different. The time it does get a little bit convoluted, where you may have to call off slightly wide, is when it is blind versus blind, because this is one loose range against another loose range, and that's going to force you to get it in there. So let's take a look at small blind limp versus a big blind all in. So we put in one big blind, we just call, and then the big blind shoves 25. We have to call it off with fours and better, ace 5 suited and better, ace 7 offsuit and better, and lots of Broadway hands. Feels a little dirty. Now look, I would not be calling it off with these hands like Jack 10 offsuit. I'm not calling off a Jack 10 offsuit for 25 big blinds. Maybe that's a mistake. Maybe I've not wrapped my head around how good the Jack 10 offsuit is. But again, if most people are shoving the spot with a relatively tight range and there are payout implications, you definitely don't want to call quite as wide as these charts recommend. All right. Small blind raise versus big blind all in. Now we get to call with a similar range, but we have a lot of better hands in our range, which is quite nice. Here we have big blind versus a small blind open shove. We just call it off with a nice strong linear range. And again, I would cut off the bottom portion of this range because again, most people don't open shove quite enough. And I think we quite often in tournament, it's good to err towards being a little bit cautious so that you do not end up going broke, because going broke is bad. And that's it. Those are all of the common scenarios you're going to be in before the flop in GTO world. Obviously, your opponents may make all sorts of weird plays that you're going to have to figure out a way to account for, but this is usually what you're going to want to be doing before the flop 25 big blinds deep. I know it's a lot. It was a mouthful. It took like 30 minutes, but it's okay. Now, we're going to go through 15 big blind ranges where we're going to go through a little bit quicker, but we're going to discuss primarily adjustments you should be making compared to when you're playing 25 big blinds deep so that you can logically adjust and know how to play those stack depths well too. Now that we've gone through 25 big blind strategy, let's discuss 15 big blind preflop strategy and primarily the adjustments you're going to want to make compared to 25 big blind poker, because a lot of players think you should play 25 big blind poker very similarly to 15 big blind poker because they're both short stacks, but they play very, very differently. So again, when folded to, you're going to want to raise to 2 big blinds. However, now when someone raises before you, you cannot 3-bet non all in, because if they make it 2 and you make it 5 and then they shove, you have to call 10 to win 30. You're getting 2 to 1 odds and you have to only win 33% of the time, which most hands will. So you're going to find that you should be shoving all in with hands that are likely good but vulnerable, especially against wide ranges. Also, a big adjustment here is that you're going to want to be defending your big blind with a very, very wide range, maybe wider than you are used to. Again, a lot of people think 15 big blinds. If someone raises, I have to go all in or fold. But that is not true. You get to call from the big blind quite wide. So we're going to go through these charts relatively quickly compared to the 25 big blind charts, but I still wanted to show them to you because they are important. Here we have preflop raising ranges when they fold to you. Under the gun, you shove almost nothing. And for all practical purposes, nothing. You're just min raising with the best hands. You're going to find that as there are fewer and fewer players yet to act, you get to open shove with a much wider range because there are fewer players yet to act who can randomly wake up with a callable hand. From the hijack, you do see now we start shoving, and the range that's going to start shoving in most of these scenarios is going to be the small and medium pairs, the decent, strong, suited, connected hands like 10-9 suited, Jack-10 suited, King-Jack suited, some decently strong ace-X offsuit. We see ace, queen, ace, jack, ace 10, ace 9 here, and then some low ace X suiteds. That's going to be a very common shoving range in a lot of these scenarios. These are the first hands that really, really, really love to shove. And then as you want to shove wider and wider, you widen that range a bit to contain more hands in those categories. Notice though, we do still not open shove with hands like aces, kings, queens, jacks, sevens. These are hands that are going to raise and then call if we get shoved on. And if you look at this range, the way it's positioned, it's pretty clear which hands we're going to min raise and then fold to a shove, which you can still raise to 2 big blinds and fold to a shove, and which hands we're going to raise and then call it off. Essentially the hands that are above the hands in dark red, so sevens and better, for example, and ace king offsuit, these are hands that are going to min raise and then call if we get shoved on. The hands that are below those, like queen 10 offsuit, that's a hand we're going to min raise and then fold if we get shoved. I'm going to show you all that in a minute. From the button, we get to raise decently wide. Notice though, we only get to play about 39% of hands. That's not that many. A lot of players play far too wide on the button. Some players open shove far too wide, and that is a mistake. Notice though, again, the hands that open shove are similar hands to when you're on the hijack, but just a wider range of shoving hands. So we see small pairs, low ace-X suiteds, all the ace-X offsuit, some offsuit Broadway hands, and some suited connected type hands. Everything else that we're going to play gets min raised. And again, the hands below, the hands in dark red mostly fold to a shove. The hands above the dark red hands mostly call a shove if you do get shoved on. All right, 15 big blind strategy. from the small blind when folded to. This is very different compared to 25 big blind play, because now you can't raise and then fold to a shove, because again, you're getting pot odds that are too good against a wide range. So you're going to find you either limp or you open shove. And when you are shoving, similar strategy, right? You're going to be shoving the ace X, small pairs, suited connected type hands, and in this scenario, because we're against only one player, also some king X and queen X offsuit hands, which are interesting, right? We still do a lot of limping though, because we want to be able to limp with all sorts of junk, because we only have to put in half a big blind to try to win 3. So in order to strengthen our calling range as much as we can, we again limp all of our best hands. We're limping all these good, strong suited hands. And if we get shoved on, we have an easy call, right? So this is going to be our small blind strategy. Obviously, adjust your opponent's tendencies. You may find that you can actually open shove super duper wide in this scenario if your opponents will fold far too often. If there are payout implications and your opponent really doesn't want to go broke, you should be shoving far wider than this recommends. You're going to find that some players will shove over your limps far too often. If that's the case, limp more good hands, limp fewer junky hands, right? So always adjust to whatever your opponent does wrong. Facing a raise, again, follow the charts. I cannot make it any more clear. Please follow the charts. You can still have a calling range, even 15 big blinds deep, and that's going to be especially true against wider ranges and when you are in later, actually when you're in all positions really, but we'll take a look at the charts in just a second, because look, even though I have a lot of these charts memorized, I'm not 100% perfect on this stuff, which is why you have to reference the charts. Reference the charts over and over until you roughly know what to do in these spots, right? As your opponent's range is wider and wider, shove all in with a wider range. You can call somewhat wide from the button if you feel inclined, and you're also going to want to defend the big blind somewhat wide. All right, hijack versus under the gun. Notice you're only shoving, no calls. So when under the gun raises, and you're in middle position, you should have no calling range 15 big blinds deep. And the reason for that is if you do call with the, call it logical calling range, suited connected type hands, small pairs, junky high cards, like king, queen, king, jack, ace 10, if you call those hands and get shoved on by someone you have to act, you can't call the all in. And that makes you very, very ripe for being exploited. Now you may say, oh, I can call aces and slow play. Well, yeah, but that doesn't fix the problem because that's only one hand. So in this scenario, you're only shoving with the absolute best hands. This is something a lot of people do wrong. They either shove way too wide, they call too often, whatever. But this spot, hijack versus under the gun raise, is something people mess up very, very often. Like I said, from the button, you do get to call slightly wider, or you get to call with a calling range, because now there's only 2 players you get to act. And to do your absolute best to be sure you can't get maximally exploited by the small blind or a big blind shove, you do slow play the pocket aces. And if you do call a hand like ace 10 suited, and the small blind shoves and the initial raiser folds, well, now you call off with the ace 10 suited. We do still make a lot of shoves though. Against under the gun, we don't get to shove all that wide, only the absolute best hands. If we're against the hijack raise though, we do get to shove substantially wider. And we don't really call all that much either. And that's because when the opponent raises from the hijack, they're gonna have a tougher time defending if we shove all in on them. Whereas if we're against under the gun, they're gonna have a very strong range, which can easily defend, but also their range is gonna be kind of strong, and we don't really wanna be shoving all that often into a strong range. As your opponent's range gets wider and wider and wider, you in turn shove more and more often. That's a very, very common thing you will see over and over and over again. From the small blind versus under the gun, you do get to call a decent amount. Like I just said, you're facing a strong range, therefore you don't shove all that often. Our shoving range is very strong. Notice our calling range is actually not that strong, which is kind of interesting to note. And you may say, isn't that bad? Well, no. And the reason it's not that detrimentally bad is because you're only against one big blind who can shove. And also, under the gun's going to call the big blind shove a decent amount of the time, especially if they know you and the small blind are calling with this range, it's going to fold a lot of the time. So they're going to be getting essentially better odds to call off. Therefore, the big blind can't shove as often as they may like. Small blind versus hijack, we're against a wider range now, so we're going to be doing a whole lot more shoving to the point that we do almost no calling at all. And in this scenario, if you just wanted to shove or fold everything, I think it's reasonable. Small blind versus button, now we're shoving a lot of hands. This is where the button's going to be raising pretty wide, and they're going to have a tough time defending against the shove. So we, in turn, rip it all in with lots of hands. Any pair, any ace, lots of strong suited hands, lots of strong offsuit hands. Notice, though, the suited connectors don't play. Let me see if I can find this same chart, 25 big blinds deep, to show you the very, very big differences in these strategies. So sear this chart into your mind. This is what we're supposed to do when we're playing 25 big blinds deep. Notice way less shoving, more calls with hands that are kind of like suited and junky big cards, right? So these hands become unplayable, small blind versus button. Small blind versus hijack. Remember this chart, small blind versus hijack? Look at all these calls with suited connected hands. So why would we be calling kind of wide in that spot, but not even playing those hands really when we are slightly shallower stacked? Well, it's because the big blind's going to shove some, and also because we're not getting the right implied odds to play those hands anymore. So you're going to find that suited connectors go way, 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 way down in value in general as you get shorter and shorter stacked, to the point that small blind versus button, you don't even get to play 8-7 suited, which is a bummer. I want to play the 8-7 suited. All right. 15 big blind ranges versus a raise. This is a spot where you're going to be defending very, very wide because you're actually going to realize your equity very well. Meaning when someone raises to 2 big blinds and you call and you flop any pair or any draw, you're just not folding. You're getting your money in. And because of that, you can defend quite wide. Again, if there are payout implications, you should fold the hands at the bottom portion of the calling range. So maybe you slice off all these hands and fold them instead, just to avoid tough spots and to get rid of all these hands that are barely break even. But you should be calling really, really wide in this spot, like with all suited hands. Notice the shoving range is going to be kind of consistent, where against a tight range, you shove a lot of pairs and strong ace-x. Against wider ranges, you shove all the pairs and weaker ace-x, right? Plus some low ace-x suiteds. And against the widest range, you're shoving almost any pair, lots of ace-x, and even some king-x suited in there. But a pretty wide calling range, calling everything except the worst offsuit hands. Here we have blind versus blind ranges. Again, definitely adjust to whatever your opponent does wrong. It's very, very important to figure out what your opponent does wrong, because if they limp too often, you can shove a lot. If they shove a lot, you can call a lot. Whatever. This is the GTO strategy, though. Here, big blind versus small blind limp, you raise small with all the nuts and some junk. This is actually very similar to the 25 big blind range for this same scenario, and that's good. It makes your life easy. Big blind versus small blind all in, you now have to call off quite wide, wider than you may like. And that's because in this situation, the small blind's now going to be open shoving with a wider range, right? As stacks get shallower, they can shove wider. Therefore, you have to defend wider. Small blind versus a big blind raise. So small blind limps, big blind raises. This is an interesting chart where we shove most of our good hands. We do still slow play a little bit. But now we see our bluffs coming from this portion of our range. This is definitely non-intuitive. You would not know this unless you studied. But we see low King X, Queen X, and Jack X suiteds liking to shove in this scenario, which is interesting. Interesting to say the least. When we do limp, though, and the big blind raises to 2.5 or 3 big blinds, we do still call a decent amount of the time. That's because, again, we're going to realize our equity very well. We make a hand, we don't fold, and we just be happy jamming our money in. You got to realize when you get down to 15 big blinds, you're probably going to go broke. And you got to get your money in there kind of wide, because you're always getting decent pot odds and you're always going to have some equity. All right, 15 big blind strategy facing an all-in 3-bet. So we raise, someone jams. Again, call off tighter due to the payout implications. Also adjust to your opponent's tendencies. Even at this stack depth, some players may have a non-all-in 3-bet strategy or non-all-in 3-bet range, which you definitely want to account for. Some players, I mean, look, players are going to do all sorts of stuff is what it amounts to, right? Some people are going to go all in too often. Some players are going to never go all in. They're just going to call everything. Like, look, people are going to make all sorts of mistakes. They're going to play all sorts of strategies, and you need to use a little bit of logic to figure out what they're going to do. But against the GTO strategy, here is how you call off. And you're going to find that these calling ranges are much wider compared to when you were facing a 25 big blind all in, because now we're getting better pot odds, right? Now I have to put in 13 to win 32.5. Whereas against the 25 big blind raise, we have to put in 23 to win 52.5. So we have to win far less often. And because we have to win far less often, we're going to call off far wider. Let's just take a look under the gun against hijack here. Take a look at that range. And you see, we're just proportionally folding more. We raised wider and we're folding more hands here. Yeah, so we see like ace-jack offsuit calls, right? So we're raising a slightly different range, but you do see we are calling off much wider in general, right? Before ace-queen offsuit was close. Now ace-queen's a slam dunk and ace-jack even calls, right? So we do see similar calling range under the gun against button, because button can't shove that wide. Hijack against button. Notice we don't have these hands in the middle in gray because we would have open shoved them pre-flop. But we do still see all the best hands call and the weaker hands fold. Like I mentioned earlier, when you start to have open shoves, the hands kind of like at the bottom of that range opt to fold. So we see like all these lower suited connected hands type hands like to fold here. So that can help you with the patterns. Here we have under the gun versus small blind. So under the gun raises, small blind shoves. Again, we just call off with the best hands, pairs, ace 10 suited, ace jack offsuit, king jack suited and better. Hijack versus small blind. Similar strategy, just calling off the good hands, folding the junk. Button versus small blind. Look at this weird chart. Again, we would have open shoved all these hands in the middle that are gray, but this actually really demonstrates how when we min raise, you see the hands on the bottom of these hands in gray here. These are the hands that fold to a shove for the most part. So we see most of these offsuit Broadway hands folding, or offsuit hands in general. The junky suited hands fold, and then the hands that were above these hands that would have open shove, these hands all call. Similar strategy from the facing a big blind shove. It's very, very common stuff at this point where hands that are good call, hands that are bad fold. The question is how wide does that range seem? But if you've studied your initial preflop opening ranges, you'll know, like, ace 5 suited is above the line of hands that shove, therefore I'm going to be calling it. Queen jack 10 offsuit's below the hands of lines that below the hands that would have shoved, therefore I fold it. Then we have one more chart here before we discuss 10 big blind poker. This is big blind versus a small blind all in. This is where it folds around to the small blind, they rip it all in the big blind, we have to call off pretty wide. King 3 suited and better, king 7 offsuit and better. Queen 8 suited, queen 9 offsuit, jack 10 offsuit, jack 9 suited. Tough spot, dicey spot. Most people don't call quite enough here. And again, when there are payout implications, you probably should call a little bit tighter. But this is a spot where you do need to call off pretty wide because your opponent's open shoving range should be pretty wide. Now let's discuss another major strategic change you're going to have to make as you get even shallower down to 10 big blinds. Now, at this point, for simplicity, I recommend using the Push or Fold app we have in the Poker Coaching app. It's completely free. Check it out. And the reason for this is because while you can use a min raise or shove strategy at this stacked depth, it doesn't really gain you that much equity. And it gets really tricky to play, especially after the flop if you raise and someone calls, because then you got to get it in pretty wide due to your amazing pot odds. If you just rip it in pre-flop, you're going to lose a little bit of EV compared to perfect GTO poker, but not much, and it's going to be super duper easy to implement. The main exception to this is when you're playing blind versus blind, because you should be limping from the small blind still, again, because you have to put in half a big blind to try to win 3. Realize your opponents may use all sorts of strategies, 10 big blinds deep. I do think most people opt to just use a shove or fold strategy, especially in the non-super high stakes games, because it's easy and these charts are freely available on my site and everywhere else. So let's take a look at preflop shoving ranges, okay? Under the gun, 10 big blinds deep. This presumes there is an ante in play. So if there's no ante, you're going to shove tighter. But you see what's shoving here, 3s and better, ace 5 suited, ace 7 suited and better, any 2 suited cards 9 or higher, ace 10 offsuit, and king queen. Notice king jack, queen jack, ace 9, 9 8 suited, ace 7 suited, ace 6 suited, ace 3 suited. These hands are not good enough to shove for 10 big blinds under the gun in this scenario. Under the gun is 8-handed, I believe, in this chart. Look it up in the app. All right, hijack gets the shove much, much wider, right? We see almost any ace, 2s and better, lots of high suited connected type hands, and any offsuit Broadway hands are opting to shove now. And then from the button, you get to shove really wide, right? A much wider range of suited hands. Queen 4 suited and better, king 5 offsuit and better, any 2 cards 9 or higher, lots of suited connected hands and suited gapped hands. So all the hands that are in white opt to fold, all the hands in blue opt to shove. All right, let's talk about small blind strategy. Here I wanted to show you the main difference, where I definitely recommend you don't play the shove or fold strategy. Because notice here, the small blind can shove. If your only options are shove or fold, the small blind can only shove 72% of hands, right? But if you're using the GTO strategy, or at least a limp or shove strategy, you actually get to play 80% of hands. So that 8% difference of hands you get to play is the widest it's going to be whenever you're looking at the differences in min raise or shove compared to just open shove only. That does matter, and I think you probably want to do it. So here is the actual GTO strategy where you're limping with a lot of your best hands and hands that can call it off. Again, all the hands above the hands that are open shoving, limp, and then call. All the hands below These are going to be the junky suited hands and junky offsuit hands. These hands limp and then fold to a shove. Nice and easy. But this is something I would definitely recommend you learn because it matters. It does matter to be able to play an extra 8% of hands in this situation. Now let's discuss when you are facing an all-in. So this is when someone shoves before you and now it is on you. You're going to want to call off with hands that have the correct equity based on your pot odds while still accounting for the players yet to act. As there are more players yet to act, you must call off tighter and tighter. Say under the gun shoves and you're in second position, you're going to call off really tight. But if under the gun shoves and you're in the big blind, you're going to call off substantially wider because there's now no one yet to act who can wake up with the nuts. Whereas when you're under the gun, all the players yet to act can look at a random hand and have the nuts. So that's a very, very important thing to note. Also, I would definitely recommend to call off a little bit tighter than these charts are going to recommend because, again, in tournaments, you don't want to go broke. And I also think most people don't shove quite as often as they should. Also realize your opponents may be using they may not be using the all-in or fold strategy. They may be limping sometimes. They may be min raising. They may be shoving way too wide. They may be shoving way too loose. Whatever it is, you're going to want to figure out what they do wrong so that you can account for it. That said, here are the GTO charts, assuming your opponent uses shove or fold. So, hijack versus under the gun all-in, super duper nitty calling strategy. And like I said, you probably want to call even a little bit tighter than this. So if you wanted to fold sixes, ace-10 suited, ace-jack offsuit, king-queen suited, I think it's probably fine. And it's even more fine whenever you're getting near a payout jump. And button versus under the gun. So you're against the same exact shoving range, but notice you get to call wider. And this is because there are now fewer players yet to act who can wake up with a random hand. As your opponent's range gets wider, you're going to call off with a wider range. So we see button versus hijack. Now we call off decently wide, right? Fours and better, ace-5 suited, ace-8 offsuit, king-10 suited, king-jack offsuit, queen-jack suited. And that's because we're against a wider range, and there's only two players yet to act, which lets us call off wider and wider, right? That said, again, you probably want to cut off the bottom portion of this range and call a little bit tighter than it recommends. Here we see the differences based on the opponent's open shoving range. So small blind versus under the gun all in, we call really tight. Small blind versus hijack raising range, we call still decently tight. Notice GTO really likes jack-10 suited, queen-jack suited, queen-9 suited, jack-9 suited, stuff like that. Look, you probably should still put it in with these hands. They are decent, but it sure feels bad to call it off with a jack-10 suited. But you have to realize jack-10 suited is going to win roughly like 48% of the time or something, and you're getting pot odds. Therefore, it's good. It's a little bit of an edge, and those little edges add up in time. But when there are payout implications, etc., you definitely want to make a point to not be so concerned with maximizing every little tiny edge, so maybe you do want to fold those. Small blind versus a button shove, we get to call off pretty wide at this point, as you can see. Here we have big blind versus under the gun. Again, exact same ranges we're facing in this chart, but because there's now no one yet to act, this is the difference we get to call because now there's no one yet to act. Take a look at the difference here, right? So notice small blind against under the gun. We're calling off a whole lot wider in the big blind, right? Take a look at small blind versus hijack, right? Small blind versus hijack, we get to call off way wider. And big blind versus button, we get to call off super wide, a whole lot wider. And that's because now there's no one yet to act. As there are players yet to act, you have to call off a whole lot tighter. Here's the big blind strategy versus a small blind all in. Both these charts are similar-ish. They're slightly different, but similar enough. When the small blind shoves near the big blind, you do need to call off pretty wide, as we see here. Any pair, lots of queen X suiteds, lots of jack X suiteds, queen 7 offsuit type stuff. Calling off in this vicinity is going to be fine. Again, you're probably going to cut off the bottom portion of the range to account for payout implications and not wanting to go broke. Okay, look, that's it. We covered all the standard pre-flop spots from a GTO point of view. I realize your opponents may play very different strategies in very different ranges, and that is fine and good. We can't cover all the spots here today, but this will get you started and you're going to be way better than most of your opponents if you understand everything we just went through.